Canada's auto sector is celebrating one of the big stories that emerged from this week's North American Leaders Summit in Mexico City. An arbitration panel has ruled in favor of Canada and Mexico and against the United States in a significant trade dispute.
50 billion United States dollars in annual vehicle and auto parts trade is quietly disappearing from the United States economy, not because of recession, not because of global demand, but because a trade war built on tariffs has fractured North America's most critical industrial supply chain and handed strategic control to Canada and Mexico. This is not a future risk. It is already happening. As the United States continues to defend tariffs as a tool of economic strength, Canada and Mexico have moved with precision and speed, constructing a fully integrated automotive corridor that increasingly functions without American participation. This is not a story about politics. It is a story about capital, contracts, and consequences. And before this analysis ends, we will reveal the one decision buried deep inside the trade war that permanently shifted the balance of power away from the United States, a move few outside the industry have ever seen coming. Listen carefully, because the most damaging part of this story has not yet been told. The collapse did not begin with factory closures. It began with math. When tariffs were imposed across steel, aluminum, and automotive components, the cost structure of manufacturing inside the United States changed overnight. What Washington framed as leverage translated inside boardrooms into a red flag that could not be ignored. Within 18 months, the average cost of assembling a vehicle in the United States rose by between 12 and 22% compared to equivalent production in Canada and Mexico. That gap was not theoretical. It was calculated line by line, contract by contract, by automakers whose margins rarely exceed single digits. At the same time, American suppliers began losing bids they had held for decades. A wiring harness once sourced from Ohio could now be produced in Mexico at a lower cost and delivered to a Canadian assembly plant without crossing a single United States tariff checkpoint. Battery modules that once moved through Midwest logistics hubs were rerouted entirely, shaving days off delivery times and millions off annual operating costs. Internal industry tallies showed more than 96 billion United States dollars in planned automotive investment had been withdrawn, delayed, or redirected away from American facilities. That capital did not vanish. It moved, primarily to Canada and Mexico. The impact inside the United States was immediate and severe. Vehicle output fell by hundreds of thousands of units. Entire engine and transmission plants dropped below 60% utilization, a threshold that signals the end of reinvestment. Once a plant crosses that line, it becomes a candidate for closure, not modernization. What makes this fracture especially dangerous is that supply chains did not merely adjust, they redesigned themselves to avoid the United States entirely. Logistics routes, compliance systems, and sourcing strategies were rebuilt with one guiding principle: never depend on a tariff-exposed node again. This is the moment many in Washington failed to recognize. The trade war did not weaken foreign competitors. It taught them how to operate without America. We will expose the internal production forecasts that quietly confirmed this fracture was not temporary, including the specific threshold after which the United States auto sector cannot recover its lost ground. The most dangerous stage of a trade war is not the announcement of tariffs. It is the moment supply chains conclude that the country imposing them is no longer essential. That moment has already arrived for the United States. By early 2025, confidential production and logistics models circulating inside the global automotive industry delivered a conclusion that stunned even seasoned executives. North America's future vehicle growth was no longer anchored in the United States. It had shifted decisively into a Canada-Mexico auto corridor designed to operate independently of American factories, American ports, and American political stability. This was not an adjustment. It was a severance. Between 2022 and 2025, more than 180 billion United States dollars in automotive capital was committed across Canada and Mexico. This included vehicle assembly, battery manufacturing, mineral processing, software integration, and autonomous driving systems. During the same period, the United States did not simply lose investment, it lost eligibility. Entire classes of production were removed from consideration for American locations. Next-generation electric vehicle platforms were engineered around Canadian energy infrastructure. High-volume assembly was optimized for Mexican logistics. Supplier contracts were rewritten to avoid United States customs exposure altogether. This is what lockout looks like in modern manufacturing. Once a platform decision is made, it typically governs production for 10 to 15 years. When American facilities were excluded from those decisions, they were not sidelined temporarily. They were erased from the future map. For General Motors and Ford, the implications are existential. Internal capacity planning now shows that by 2028, nearly 20% of potential North American vehicle production will occur entirely outside the United States, even for vehicles sold to American consumers. These vehicles will be designed in Canada, assembled in Mexico, and imported into the United States at a cost advantage American factories cannot match under existing tariff structures. This is not offshoring in the traditional sense. It is strategic displacement. The trade war created a permanent cost penalty for producing inside the United States. Tariffs inflated material costs. Compliance delays slowed logistics. Policy volatility forced automakers to price uncertainty into every American investment decision. Over time, these penalties accumulated until the math became undeniable. Once American plants fell below 65% utilization, reinvestment stopped. Once reinvestment stopped, decline became inevitable. Heavy manufacturing does not survive on sentiment. It survives on throughput. As utilization collapsed, supplier networks collapsed with it. Smaller manufacturers that depended on anchor plants lost contracts and cash flow. Bankruptcy filings surged. Skilled workers exited the industry entirely, taking decades of experience with them. These losses cannot be reversed with incentives or speeches. Meanwhile, the Canada-Mexico corridor entered a self-reinforcing cycle. Canada secured upstream control through energy reliability, mineral access, and battery production. Mexico absorbed downstream scale through assembly and logistics. Together, they formed a closed loop that no longer required American participation to function efficiently. Trade flow analysis now confirms that up to 50 billion United States dollars in annual vehicle and parts trade will permanently bypass American production nodes once the corridor reaches full capacity. This is not a peak estimate. It is a baseline. That figure compounds year after year. It erodes wages. It shrinks tax bases. It weakens pension systems tied to manufacturing employment. Entire regions that once formed the backbone of American industrial strength now face long-term economic contraction. What makes this lockout especially severe is that it extends beyond factories. Research and development followed production out of the United States. Software teams relocated to where vehicles are built. Battery research moved closer to energy and mineral sources. Autonomous systems development clustered around corridors with regulatory continuity and stable funding. The United States did not just lose manufacturing, it lost innovation adjacency. And once innovation ecosystems relocate, they do not return on election cycles. They remain where talent, capital, and certainty align. Canada understood this. It did not need confrontation. It needed consistency. It delivered predictable energy pricing, long-term industrial policy, and zero tariff exposure within the corridor. Mexico delivered execution at scale. Together, they removed uncertainty from the equation. Washington, by contrast, introduced it. What the United States failed to grasp is that tariffs do not simply tax imports. They train global industries to redesign themselves around avoidance. Once that redesign is complete, the imposing country loses leverage forever. And in the next part, we will expose the single structural advantage that allowed Canada to become the anchor of this corridor an advantage so decisive that even the complete removal of tariffs would no longer bring production back to the United States. That advantage is already locking the future in place. Every modern auto industry is ultimately constrained by one factor that no amount of political messaging can override: infrastructure. Not roads or ports alone, but the systems that determine whether factories can operate at scale, at predictable cost, for decades at a time. In this trade war, infrastructure became the silent judge, and the verdict was devastating for the United States. Canada entered this phase of industrial competition with an advantage the United States underestimated for years. Its electricity system delivers stable, low-cost, low-volatility power across manufacturing regions without the transmission bottlenecks that plague American industrial zones. For energy-intensive industries like electric vehicles and batteries, this difference is not marginal, it is decisive. Internal cost modeling used by global automakers shows that producing a single next-generation electric vehicle battery pack in Canada can be thousands of United States dollars cheaper per unit than producing the same pack in the United States once energy instability, grid congestion, and peak pricing are factored in. That cost gap widens every year as American grids strain under demand while Canadian capacity expands. Once factories are built around those assumptions, they cannot simply be lifted and moved. Mexico complements this advantage with scale and speed. Its manufacturing zones are engineered for continuous throughput, rapid tooling changes, and predictable labor availability, all connected to logistics corridors optimized for export. When paired with Canadian upstream production, the result is a closed industrial loop that operates faster and cheaper than any system involving the United States. This is where the trade war crossed into permanent damage. Tariffs did not merely increase costs, they forced automakers to redesign platforms around locations that could guarantee infrastructure stability without political risk. Once those platforms were locked, the United States ceased to be a viable default option. The implications ripple far beyond factory floors. Battery supply contracts have now been signed, extending well into the late 2030s, anchored to Canadian energy and mineral processing facilities. Software architecture, power electronics, and autonomous systems are being developed alongside those platforms, embedding innovation where production resides. In contrast, the United States remains trapped in fragmented policy and aging systems. Grid upgrades face years of permitting delays. Transmission projects stall under legal and political opposition. Manufacturers cannot plan 10 or 15-year investments in an environment where energy access itself is uncertain. This uncertainty carries a measurable cost. Industry risk assessments now assign American manufacturing locations a permanent volatility penalty, increasing financing costs and reducing expected returns. Even when labor productivity is high, the infrastructure discount overwhelms those gains. As a result, American plants are increasingly relegated to legacy internal combustion platforms with shrinking demand. These facilities absorb higher costs while competing against newer, more efficient operations outside the country. Over time, margins collapse and reinvestment becomes irrational. The human impact follows a predictable pattern. When factories lose future platforms, they lose skilled workers. When skilled workers leave, training pipelines collapse. Communities that once anchored regional economies enter long-term decline, not because of globalization, but because of strategic exclusion. Canada experiences the opposite trajectory. High-skill employment clusters around battery engineering, software development, and systems integration. Wage growth accelerates as demand for specialized labor outpaces supply. Educational institutions align curricula with guaranteed industrial demand rather than speculative recovery. Mexico locks in scale employment that stabilizes its manufacturing base for decades. Once hundreds of thousands of workers are embedded in a functioning corridor, political and economic incentives reinforce continuity. That stability further attracts capital, completing the cycle. What makes this verdict so severe is that it operates independently of future elections or policy reversals. Infrastructure decisions outlast administrations. Factories built today define supply chains for a generation. Even a complete rollback of tariffs would not restore American centrality. The corridor no longer depends on access to the United States. It delivers vehicles to global markets efficiently without American participation in production. In trade wars, the losing side often believes damage can be undone with negotiation. In industrial competition, lost infrastructure advantage is rarely recovered. Once capital settles where systems work, it stays there. We will reveal the internal employment projections that show how this infrastructure verdict translates into a workforce collapse inside the United States that policymakers are not publicly acknowledging, numbers so severe that they threaten the long-term viability of entire regions. Those figures exist. They are already circulating quietly. And they change everything. Every trade war eventually reveals its true cost, not in trade balances, but in employment. Jobs are where policy decisions become permanent, because once a workforce disperses, it cannot simply be reassembled. In the case of the United States auto sector, that dispersion has already begun at a scale few officials are willing to acknowledge publicly. Since 2022, more than 300,000 direct and indirect automotive jobs have disappeared across the United States. These are not temporary furloughs tied to demand cycles, but structural losses tied to plant closures, supplier failures, and canceled future platforms. Each lost job ripples outward, removing income, tax revenue, and consumer spending from entire regions. The most alarming losses are not occurring on assembly lines alone. Supplier networks, which employ several times more workers than final assembly plants, have been hollowed out at unprecedented speed. When a major contract shifts from an American plant to a Canada-Mexico corridor facility, dozens of smaller firms lose volume simultaneously, triggering cascades of layoffs and insolvencies. Internal labor modeling now circulating among industry planners, projects that by the end of this decade, an additional 450,000 United States auto-linked jobs are at risk if current production trajectories remain unchanged. These losses are concentrated in states once considered politically untouchable because of their manufacturing importance. The implication is clear: no region is insulated anymore. What makes this collapse especially severe is its timing. The transition from internal combustion vehicles to electric platforms was supposed to cushion employment losses by creating new categories of work. Instead, those new jobs are being created almost entirely outside the United States. Battery manufacturing, software integration, power electronics, and autonomous systems development now cluster where production platforms are anchored. As those anchors shifted into Canada and Mexico, employment followed. The United States did not merely miss out on growth, it lost replacement pathways for workers leaving legacy plants. This creates a demographic trap. Older workers displaced from internal combustion facilities face retraining barriers that are difficult to overcome without local electric vehicle investment. Younger workers see no long-term prospects and migrate elsewhere, draining communities of both experience and future labor. Municipal data from former manufacturing towns shows declining property values, shrinking school enrollments, and rising infrastructure maintenance gaps. These are not abstract trends. They are the measurable symptoms of an industry exiting without replacement. Canada's labor market tells a sharply different story. Since 2023, more than 140,000 new high-skill automotive and advanced manufacturing jobs have been created. These positions are concentrated in batteries, artificial intelligence, systems engineering, and advanced materials, with wages significantly higher than traditional assembly roles. Training pipelines in Canada are aligned directly with guaranteed industrial demand. Apprenticeships feed into facilities already under construction. Universities collaborate with manufacturers whose investment timelines extend decades into the future. This alignment creates workforce stability that compounds over time. Mexico secures a different but equally durable advantage. High-volume assembly employment locks in hundreds of thousands of jobs tied to export corridors that now bypass the United States entirely. Once these labor forces are embedded, Political and economic incentives ensure continuity regardless of external pressure. The contrast exposes the most damaging misconception behind the trade war. Policymakers assumed employment could be protected by restricting trade. In reality, employment followed certainty, infrastructure, and access, not borders. The United States now faces a shrinking employment base, supporting a still large but increasingly import-dependent auto market. Vehicles sold to American consumers are increasingly built elsewhere, eroding the connection between consumption and production. This disconnect weakens bargaining power, fiscal stability, and long-term economic security. What makes recovery so difficult is that labor loss is not reversible on political timelines. Skills decay. Tooling is scrapped. Supplier relationships dissolve. When investment finally returns, if it returns at all, the workforce required to support it no longer exists locally. This is how industrial decline becomes self-sustaining. Job losses reduce local demand. Reduced demand discourages reinvestment. Lack of reinvestment accelerates further job losses. Breaking this cycle requires intervention on a scale far larger than tariff removal. And yet, the most troubling detail has not been discussed publicly. Internal projections show that employment losses are not evenly distributed. Certain regions face concentration risks so severe that entire local economies could lose their primary employment base within a single decade. We will reveal those regional projections and explain why some areas of the United States are facing an employment shock so concentrated that recovery may no longer be possible, regardless of future trade policy changes. Those numbers exist. They are already being modeled, and they reveal a level of risk few Americans have been told to expect. The employment collapse triggered by the trade war is not evenly distributed across the United States. It is geographically concentrated in ways that transform an industrial problem into a regional economic emergency. Internal projections show that several states, once considered the core of American manufacturing, now face exposure levels that threaten the viability of entire local economies. The most severe concentration appears in the Midwest manufacturing belt. States that relied heavily on engine, transmission, and powertrain facilities now find themselves anchored to technologies being phased out without replacement. When electric vehicle platforms bypass these regions, there is no secondary industry ready to absorb displaced workers. In several Midwestern counties, automotive manufacturing accounts for more than 1/4 of total private sector employment. When a single anchor plant drops below sustainable utilization, the surrounding supplier ecosystem collapses in parallel. This creates a multiplier effect that accelerates job losses far beyond the factory gates. Regional fiscal data already reflects this shift. Local governments face shrinking tax bases just as demand for social services rises. Infrastructure maintenance is deferred, school districts consolidate, and municipal credit ratings weaken, raising borrowing costs at precisely the moment investment is most needed. The southern manufacturing corridor faces a different but equally dangerous risk. Facilities that once benefited from lower costs now struggle to justify reinvestment as future vehicle platforms are assigned elsewhere. Without electric vehicle or battery commitments, these plants drift into long-term stagnation rather than sudden closure, masking the severity of decline until it becomes irreversible. Western states with smaller but highly specialized auto clusters face talent drain rather than immediate unemployment spikes. Engineers and technicians relocate to Canada and Mexico where new platforms are being built. Once this expertise leaves, rebuilding advanced manufacturing capacity becomes exponentially more difficult. What unites these regions is the absence of replacement industries. The trade war did not merely remove jobs, it removed pathways. Electric vehicles, batteries, and software-defined manufacturing were supposed to absorb displaced labor. Instead, those pathways now terminate outside the United States. Canada's regional planning illustrates the contrast. Provinces targeted industrial investment with precision, aligning energy infrastructure, workforce training, and logistics to specific manufacturing clusters. This coordination ensured that new jobs replaced declining ones without leaving gaps. Mexico followed a parallel strategy focused on scale and continuity. Entire regions were designated as long-term assembly and export zones, creating employment stability that reinforces political and economic commitment. Once such zones mature, they resist disruption. The United States, by contrast, allowed regions to compete against one another for diminishing investment while introducing policy uncertainty at the national level. This fragmented approach amplified regional disparities rather than mitigating them. Some areas now face employment concentration risks so high that even a return of growth would not restore balance. Internal modeling now warns of tipping points. When automotive employment in a region falls below a critical mass, supplier density collapses permanently. Once that density is lost, new manufacturers avoid the region regardless of incentives, citing lack of ecosystem support. This dynamic transforms decline into destiny. Regions do not merely lose jobs, they lose relevance. Capital, talent, and innovation bypass them in favor of corridors where systems already function. The long-term implications extend beyond economics. Regions experiencing concentrated industrial decline also experience political polarization, population loss, and declining public trust. These social effects further complicate recovery, creating feedback loops that reinforce stagnation. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that these regional outcomes were predictable. Industry planners modeled them years ago. The data circulated quietly while public debate focused on headline trade figures rather than structural exposure. The trade war narrative emphasized national strength, but its consequences are local and deeply personal. Entire communities now face futures defined not by transition, but by exclusion from the next industrial cycle. And yet, the most severe projection remains largely undisclosed. Certain regions are now flagged as non-recoverable under current industrial trajectories, meaning that even a complete reversal of trade policy would not restore their manufacturing base. In the final part, we will reveal how these regional losses translate into a national strategic imbalance and why the United States risks becoming a consumption economy dependent on external production for one of its most critical industries. When a nation loses control of how it produces what it consumes, it loses more than factories. It loses leverage, resilience, and ultimately sovereignty over its own economic future. This is the strategic position the United States is now drifting toward as a direct consequence of the trade war and its reliance on tariffs as a primary tool of industrial policy. The United States remains one of the largest automobile markets in the world. Millions of vehicles will continue to be sold to American consumers each year. What has changed is where those vehicles are designed, built, and technologically anchored. Increasingly, vehicles sold in the United States will be conceived in Canada, assembled in Mexico, powered by batteries sourced and processed outside American borders, and supported by software ecosystems developed beyond United States jurisdiction. Consumption remains domestic, control does not. This shift fundamentally alters the balance of power. A nation that consumes without producing loses bargaining strength in trade negotiations, influence over standards, and the ability to respond to shocks. In previous decades, the United States could leverage its manufacturing base to shape global automotive rules. That leverage is now weakening. Canada understands this dynamic clearly. By anchoring energy, minerals, batteries, and advanced manufacturing within its borders, it has positioned itself as the upstream gatekeeper of the North American auto system. Mexico complements this position by controlling scale and execution downstream. Together, they form a corridor that no longer requires American participation to function efficiently. The United States is no longer the indispensable link. It is a customer. This transformation carries national security implications that extend beyond economics. Modern vehicles are platforms for data, energy management, and autonomous systems. Control over their production intersects with defense logistics, infrastructure, resilience, and technological leadership. As production and innovation move outward, the United States becomes increasingly dependent on external systems for technologies embedded deep within daily life and critical infrastructure. This dependency reduces strategic flexibility in times of crisis when access, pricing, and prioritization matter most. The trade war narrative promised strength through pressure. What it delivered was fragmentation. Tariffs introduced uncertainty into a system that demands predictability. Capital responded rationally by relocating to environments where rules are stable and infrastructure is aligned with long-term investment horizons. Once capital relocates at scale, it reshapes institutions around it. Universities adjust research priorities. Cities adapt labor markets. Supply chains thicken where activity concentrates. Over time, these changes harden into structural reality. This is why reversal is so difficult. Even if tariffs were removed entirely tomorrow, the architecture of the auto industry would not revert. Contracts, platforms, and ecosystems have already been built elsewhere. The United States would be asking to re-enter a system that has learned to operate without it. What makes this outcome especially sobering is that it was not imposed by foreign adversaries. It was enabled by domestic policy choices that underestimated the speed and discipline with which modern industries adapt. Trade wars are often framed as contests of will. In reality, they are contests of systems. The system that removed friction, stabilized inputs, and reduced risk won. The system that introduced volatility lost. Canada did not defeat the United States through confrontation. It outcompeted through execution. Mexico did not challenge American dominance directly. It absorbed the functions America made expensive and uncertain. The United States now faces a defining question. It can continue to defend policies that have already produced measurable decline, or it can confront the reality that tariffs alone cannot build modern industrial power. Rebuilding will require infrastructure, consistency, and a recognition that global supply chains punish unpredictability. The most dangerous misconception would be to assume this outcome is limited to automobiles. The same dynamics apply to semiconductors, energy storage, advanced manufacturing, and defense-related technologies. What happened here is a template. History rarely records moments like this in dramatic headlines. It records them later, as turning points that seemed invisible at the time. This trade war will not be remembered for its rhetoric. It will be remembered for the industries that quietly moved on. And the final shock is this. Internal strategic assessments now warn that unless structural conditions change, the United States risks repeating this pattern across multiple sectors simultaneously, accelerating a transition from industrial leader to managed consumer economy. Those assessments exist. They are being read quietly. And they suggest that the story you have just heard is not the end of the crisis. It is only the beginning.